I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, in the same house where my late husband and I raised our only son, David. Since my husband passed 5 years ago, the silence can be a bit much, but my garden and my best friend, Linda, keep me busy. I spent 40 years as a teacher, shaping young minds, and I always believed in leading with kindness, patience, and a firm sense of fairness. Principles I thought I had successfully passed on to my son. The last year, however, has taught me that sometimes the harshest lessons are the ones you have to teach your own family. This is the story of how a single social media post meant to mock my old-fashioned ways led to my daughter-in-law losing the beautiful rent-free home I had provided for her and my son. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in the corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My late husband, Richard, was a man who believed in building a future. He wasn't just an architect by trade. He was an architect of our family's security. Over the decades, we worked tirelessly, saved diligently, and invested wisely. We weren't flashy people. We drove sensible cars and took modest vacations. Our biggest indulgence was real estate. Richard had a keen eye for properties with potential, and by the time he passed, we owned our own home outright, as well as a second, smaller house in a lovely up-and-coming neighborhood just 20 minutes away. This second house was our nest egg, our safety net. We'd bought it when it was a fixer-upper, and for years, Richard had poured his weekends and his heart into it. He rebuilt the porch, landscaped the yard, and modernized the kitchen. It was his masterpiece, a tangible symbol of his love and foresight. After his passing, the house sat empty for a while. The rental income would have been nice, but the thought of strangers living in a place so full of his memory felt wrong. I couldn't bring myself to rent it out, let alone sell it. When our son David announced his engagement to Jessica, I was cautiously optimistic. David, now a 35-year-old architect like his father, was a good, steady man. He was quiet and focused, sometimes to a fault, often getting lost in his projects and overlooking the subtleties of human emotion. Jessica, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of energy. At 33, she was a lifestyle blogger, a profession I admittedly didn't fully understand. Her life seemed to be a curated collection of perfect moments shared online for her thousands of followers. She was charming, beautiful, and always seemed to know the right thing to say. But beneath the polished surface, I sometimes felt a chill, a sense of calculation that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I brushed my reservations aside, telling myself I was just being an overprotective mother. David was happy, and that's what mattered. When they got married, they were living in a cramped apartment downtown, paying an exorbitant amount of rent. They spoke often of wanting to save for a down payment on a house, but with student loans and the cost of living, it felt like a distant dream for them. Seeing their struggle and wanting to give them the best possible start, I made a generous offer. They could live in Richard's house. I wouldn't charge them a penny in rent. My conditions were simple, and I thought eminently reasonable. First, they had to cover the monthly utilities and property taxes. It was a fraction of what they'd pay in rent, and it would instill a sense of responsibility. Second, they had to maintain the property, mow the lawn, tend to the garden Richard had planted, and keep the house in the pristine condition he had left it in. I made it clear that the house was, and would remain, in my name. It was not a gift of property, but a gift of opportunity, a chance to live without the burden of rent so they could save aggressively for their own future. David was overwhelmed with gratitude. He hugged me tightly, his eyes misty as he spoke of how much this would mean to them. "Thank you, Mom. Dad would have loved this. We'll take care of it, I promise," he said, and I knew he meant it. Jessica's reaction was a bit different. She squealed with delight, immediately pulling out her phone to take pictures. "Oh my God, a house with a yard. My followers are going to die," she exclaimed. Her excitement seemed genuine, but it was all directed at the content she could create. She talked about a modern farmhouse aesthetic, about vintage chic renovations, and about how perfect the natural light was for her photos. She didn't mention my late husband, the man who had built the very thing she was so excited to showcase. It was a small thing, a minor discordant note in a happy moment, but it stuck with me. They moved in a month later. For the first year, things seemed to be going well. I would visit every few weeks, always calling ahead. The house was usually tidy, at least on the surface. Jessica had filled it with neutral-toned furniture, artfully placed throw blankets, and an army of potted plants. It looked like a page from a magazine, impersonal but stylish. She often posted pictures of their life there, tagging them with hashtags like blessed, dream home, and married life. In her online world, they were the perfect couple living a perfect life in a perfect house. I tried to connect with Jessica. I truly did. I invited her for lunch, I asked about her work, I liked her posts, and I made a point to compliment the way she had decorated the house, even if it wasn't to my personal taste. Her responses were always polite, but distant. She'd smile, thank me, and then skillfully pivot the conversation back to herself, her brand, or her latest online collaboration. She treated me less like a mother-in-law and more like a landlord she had to be pleasant to, a necessary but slightly annoying part of the deal. My son, ever busy with his work, seemed oblivious to the subtle tension. He saw a happy wife and a beautiful home, and for him, that was enough. He didn't see the way her eyes would glaze over when I told a story about his father, or the faint dismissive smirk she'd give when I offered a piece of advice. I held my tongue, reminding myself that my goal was to support my son's happiness. I had given them a foundation to build their future on, a gift from the heart. I just hoped they understood it was a gift, not a guarantee. The calm before the storm was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my kitchen, humming along to the radio and kneading dough for a loaf of bread. It was a simple, peaceful moment. My best friend, Linda, a retired nurse who possessed a pragmatism that could stop a charging rhino, was coming over for tea. Linda was my rock, the person who had held my hand through the grief of losing Richard, and who now served as my sounding board for all of life's smaller wobbles. She was also more tech-savvy than I was, navigating social media with an ease that I found both impressive and slightly baffling. Linda arrived with a grim look on her face, a stark contrast to her usual cheerful demeanor. She set her purse down on the counter with a heavy thud and held up her phone. "Helen, you need to see this," she said, her voice unusually serious. On the screen was Jessica's blog page. The post was titled, "Surviving the Boomer Invasion: How to Deal with an Overbearing Mother-in-Law." My heart sank into my stomach. It felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. The feature image was a candid photo of me, taken at their house a few weeks prior. In it, I was pointing at a wilting rosebush in the garden, my brow furrowed with concern. The angle was unflattering, making me look like a scolding, shrewish old woman. "What is this?" I whispered, my hands trembling as I took the phone. Linda pressed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Read it," she said gently. And I did. The words on the screen were a masterclass in passive aggression, cloaked in the faux inspirational language of a lifestyle blogger. She never used my name, of course. She simply referred to me as my husband's mother, or more cleverly, the landlord. She painted a picture of me as a meddling, controlling crone who used the house as a weapon. She described my visits as unannounced inspections and my gardening advice as micromanaging critiques. She twisted my concern for the rose bushes Richard had planted into a personal attack on her own abilities. Every visit comes with a list of suggestions, which is just code for everything I'm doing wrong. Apparently, the color of my throw pillows can affect the structural integrity of the house,
And my choice of organic free trade coffee is an insult to the memory of her Maxwell House-loving husband? She mocked my taste, my values, and my generation. She wrote about my ancient belief that you should clean your own gutters and my bizarre attachment to a house that was stuck in the 90s. The most painful part was a paragraph dedicated to the financial arrangement. Some people think we're so lucky to live here for free, she wrote, accompanied by a laughing emoji. But there's no such thing as a free lunch, especially when it's served with a side of guilt trips and endless expectations. The emotional rent is higher than anything we'd pay downtown, trust me. The post was full of little details that were technically true, but stripped of all context and kindness. My offer to help her fix a leaky faucet was framed as me implying she and David were incompetent. The time I brought over a casserole because I knew they were both working late was spun as a passive-aggressive comment on her cooking. Every act of generosity I had ever extended.
The next morning, I woke up with a singular purpose. The fog of hurt and confusion had lifted, replaced by a steely determination. David had told me to ignore it, to block her. I decided to do the exact opposite. I was going to dive headfirst into Jessica's world. I needed to understand the full scope of her deception, not just for my own validation, but to gather evidence. A teacher prepares her lesson plans. A general studies his battlefield. I would study my daughter-in-law. I created a new, anonymous social media account, a ghost profile with no name or picture attached. It was my key into the world she had built, a world where I had become a villain in the narrative. I spent the entire day and the next scrolling through years of her content. I went past the pretty pictures of lattes and sunsets and dug into the captions, the comments, the tone of her digital voice. What I found was a disturbing pattern of behavior that went far beyond the one blog post. Jessica had been subtly disparaging me for years. There were posts from when they first moved in, cloaked in humor. One showed a picture of the charming but ancient floral wallpaper in the guest bedroom, which my husband and I had picked out together, with a caption, "Help me convince the hubby that this isn't a family heirloom. #renovation nightmare, make it stop." Hundreds of her followers had chimed in with laughing emojis and suggestions on how to cover it up. Another post featured a beautiful antique wooden chair that had belonged to my grandmother. Jessica had painted it a ghastly shade of chalky white and posed with it, smiling. The caption read, "Giving this old piece a new life. Some people are afraid to update the past, but I say make it your own. #DIY upcycle." She was talking about my family's history as if it were a cheap piece of junk she'd found on the curb. She was erasing my family's story to create her own. The more I looked, the more I saw. There were veiled complaints about family obligations on weekends when I had invited them for dinner. There were photos of her on vacation, captioned #deserved, posted just days after David had told me they were too broke to help pay for a minor roof repair on their own home. It was a sprawling tapestry of entitlement and disrespect woven with hashtags and filters. But the most damning discovery came from a closed group for her top-tier followers, a private forum that for some reason my ghost profile was able to access. Here, behind a digital curtain, Jessica was far more candid. The passive aggression was gone, replaced by outright mockery. In this private group, she referred to me exclusively as the Dragon Lady. She posted screenshots of my polite text messages, and she and her followers would dissect them, reading malice and manipulation into my every word. "Look at her using a period at the end of a sentence. So aggressive," one commented, on a text where I had simply written, "Hope you're both well." She complained bitterly about having to perform for me during my visits. She even posted a video, a short, secretly recorded clip of me from a family Christmas gathering. In the video, I was telling a heartfelt story about Richard, my voice thick with emotion. The camera, clearly hidden, was shaky.
but the audio was clear, and overlaid on the video were mocking captions. "Here we go again, the annual tribute," with a rolling eyes emoji. They weren't just laughing at a caricature of me online. They were laughing at my genuine grief in private for their own amusement. That video was the final straw. It was proof that this was not an exaggeration for a brand. This was her real character. This was a deep-seated contempt she harbored for me, for my late husband, and for the life that we had built, a life that was now conveniently bankrolling her own. I saved everything. I took screenshots of the blog post, the comments, the old posts, the private forum discussions. I downloaded the video of me at Christmas. I created a digital folder, a meticulous collection of every jab, every lie, every piece of casual cruelty. This was no longer just about my hurt feelings. This was about a profound lack of gratitude and a shocking level of duplicity. While gathering my digital ammunition, I also dealt with the practical matter of the unpaid bills. I sent a formal, registered letter to their address. Not to my son, David, but addressed to both of them, Mr. and Mrs. D. Thompson. The letter was short, professional, and devoid of emotion. It was a formal demand for payment of the 4 months of outstanding property taxes and utilities, totaling just over $2,000. I gave them a deadline of 14 days to remit the full amount. I included copies of the original agreement they had signed, highlighting the clause about their financial responsibilities. This was no longer a family matter to be discussed over the phone. It was a business transaction, and they were in breach of contract. My friend Linda reviewed the letter before I sent it. "Perfect," she said, her eyes gleaming with approval. "You're not Helen the mother anymore. You're Helen the property owner. You're establishing a paper trail. Every step from here on out has to be deliberate and documented." She was right. I was detaching my emotions from the process. The woman they mocked online was a fictional character. The woman who owned their house, however, was very real. She was organized, she was methodical, and she had a file full of evidence that would make any judge's eyebrows shoot up. Jessica had unmasked herself through her own arrogance. Now it was time for me to unmask the consequences of her actions. The game had rules, and she had broken every one of them. It was time to show her what it felt like to lose.